Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku. I'm glad you guys can join me today. If you're not on the live stream, you're definitely listening to the playback. Just a quick note, I recently interviewed Dr. Obadeli Kambon, and the audio came out really piss poor. And I think I figured out the problem. In fact, a part of me doing this stream today is just to check that I did indeed nail the issue, and hopefully the playback for this episode is much cleaner than what you heard the last time. If I can, I will clean up the audio as best as I could and re-upload the video. If I can't, I'll have to ask the Dr. Kambon, to reappear on the show, and let's have that discussion again. Also, going forward, if you did catch the discussion and you were able to hear through all the noise, Dr. Campbell made some great points about getting off of, the Europeans' platforms, right? And that's something I had been thinking about for a while. I was trying to figure out how can we create our own platforms, but he has a platform, a bb2me.com, a bb2metv.com. You could check those out. I'm gonna start doing some episodes strictly for that site. I have an idea what the topics will be. It'll be an ongoing series. I'm gonna put some episodes strictly there. I think I'll still, at least for the time being, keep the social media going for the podcast, because a lot of you will still remain on, the social media that's out there, as opposed to 100% switching off to a Black-owned social media. I think I'll still put it up there. I think I'll still put some episodes still on YouTube, do some live streams on YouTube, but there will be some exclusive content on a bb2metv.com. That said, this is a part of the KWAZ Radio Podcast Network, and I think the idea going forward is that we'll get this network more Pan-African as far as its reach. I think we'll be looking for more persons on the continent to actually do some podcasting for the network, continent, Caribbean, and even here in the States. It's been hard to get people here in the States. Let's see what it's like, starting off in West Africa or something. Starting off in, the Caribbean where I'm from, or, one of the other island nations or what have you. But yeah, I think that's the move going forward. We really got to start to build. Because, time is running, man. That's something I took a note of recently. Like, I did something 2 years ago, and in my mind, I did it early this year, and it's actually been like 2, almost 3 years now. So it's crazy how time is flying. We gotta build. We gotta start seeing some results for our efforts too. That's the other thing. You'll hear a lot of people talking about change is slow. Change does not have to be slow. A lot of people have just accepted that change is slow, but we need to start doing more work and doing that work like ASAP. So, matter of fact, while I'm talking about this, let me also mention that Onitase, let me see if I could find the message. Onitase, yes. I'll read this to you guys. Interested in KWAZ and Kobia brainstorming session? KWA, which is the KWAZ and Kobia, KWA asks, how can we work together to bring Africa closer to Pan-African unity and a revolutionary mindset in 2021? Africa will not be revolutionary without Africans encouraging a consciousness of Pan-African unity and the need for revolution. The theme of the November brainstorm will be, what are some ways that we each can actively promote the consciousness we need in Africa and hold each other accountable to it? KWA is predisposed to a pamphlet or one-to-one talks. So is there a way to formalize and multiply our efforts? Can we work through writing pamphlets or organizing talks? What are some ideas to hold us accountable for our work in 2021? Would giving each participant a month to engage 10 new individuals, at minimum 2 local and 2 online, and every month for 6 months report our efforts in a conference, be that accountability? Would forming teams be? If interested in coming up with a plan of action for 2021, come to KWAZ and Kobia's brainstorming session. We intend to decide on what mediums we wish to use, i.e. pamphlet, one-to-one talks, interviews, and brainstorm what needs to be included in those mediums. At least 2 efforts are the end goal, but your ideas and discussions may make them more. So this session, if you're interested, here's what I'm going to do, because I don't want to put all the business out there. It's a public session. Look up Onitase, ONITTASET, right? Onitase. Look him up on Twitter, and you will see the post, or ask him for details as to where to go. I don't want to put all of that out there. I'm not sure if he wants it all out there for the interceptors to intercept. So reach out to him personally, but that's a brainstorming session that's coming up. Again, we got to start getting serious about doing work, and we got to start seeing the results in our lifetime. All right. Speaking of doing the work, this episode is a continuation of the idea to create a curriculum for the benefit of our people, particularly our children, but something that even adults will learn as they work through the courses with their kids. And this curriculum, if you remember, it's about connecting the student to their African culture, and as well as learning to come up with solutions for African problems that affect us. And, again, a lot of folks are focused on Africa. I do believe there, especially after my discussion with Dr. Cambone, like, wherever Africans are, that's our land, right? And so wherever we are, we need to start making these lands outside of the continent satellites of Africa, so to speak, right? And so the work in this curriculum can be used in the Caribbean. It can be used on the continent. Anywhere there's African people. In the United States, we have problems here that aren't being solved through elections and whatnot, because really you got to help yourself. And if the education was right, the folks in these predicaments, like for example, Flint with the water crisis, could be fixing their own problems, come up with their own solution to that water crisis, right? And by the way, they still don't have clean water. It's like at least 6 years now, right, since that crisis broke. So in today's episode, we're talking about traditional African modes of education, their relevance in the modern world. And this paper was from 2007, written by MICHAEL Omolewa. The abstract reads, this article explores the characteristics, goals, modes of transmission, teaching, and learning strategies of indigenous African education, in which the pursuit of excellence and quality has always been an important aim. Informal and vocational training constitute the core of indigenous education in Africa. Under the traditional system, each person in the community is practically trained and prepared for his or her role in society. It is a holistic system in which storytelling, proverbs, and myths also play an important role. The author suggests the adoption of some of the elements of the system into modern-day educational practice as a strategy for improving quality. So I actually read this paper a while ago, and I was supposed to present it on this platform, I think, over a year ago. And that's when I went into the hiatus and wasn't doing shows. But even when I wasn't doing shows, as you can tell, I was researching this topic of how to teach African children and African people. So we're going to read this paper and see if we can get some ideas that we can use towards the curriculum that I propose we make. And again, reach out to me and ask me. No one has yet, but reach out to me and ask me, well, how? How can I help? I'm a carpenter. I know how to build. And I have ideas about how we can teach this to, fellow African people. So the background of the paper begins. Traditional African education is an integral part of the culture and history of a local community, which is stored in various forms and transmitted through various modes. Such modes include language, music, dance, oral tradition, proverbs, myths, stories, culture, and religion. Traditional African education, which is passed from one generation to another, is usually by word of mouth and cultural rituals, and has, to some extent, been the basis for sustainable development in agriculture, food preparation, healthcare, conservation, and other sectors for many centuries. This mode of education has by and large been used as a way of acquiring lifelong learning. Contrary to the widespread belief held by early foreign observers in Africa that Africa was a dark continent before their arrival, the continent had already reached a high level of educational development, which had evolved over time. And you see this idea that these foreigners believed Africa was this dark continent. That was a part of a propaganda scheme. Remember, Europe came out of the Dark Ages just before they went into Africa and carried out, all the stuff that they, eventually carried out, which is a part of history now. But they knew, right? You had folks from, Greece, who were going to Kemet and learning and taking back the knowledge and going to Kemet and learning these stories of the Africans, and then going back to Greece, and suddenly a guy who could barely write an essay in Greece was able to go back and have 50 different books. So they knew, but it was a part of the propaganda machine. And propaganda is something that we need to start to use better, right? we got to start using propaganda to uplift the consciousness of our people. Where was I? The coming of European Western education from the late 15th century onwards disrupted the traditional system and brought the formal school system at the primary, secondary, and tertiary levels, the learning of European languages, literature, history, philosophy, as well as the science subjects, including mathematics, biology, physics, and chemistry. The Christian missionaries were later supported by the colonial administration in using the new educational system as a means of cultivating the mind of the Africans to accept European values and practices. When I spoke to Dr. Cambone during the week, one of the things he mentioned that stood out to me was the concept that, you know, Black folks have a European taste. And so because you have a European taste, you tend to consume anything European. And it started here. You know, all that Christianity and all that Islam and all that kind of bullshit. This is the problem that it led to. And we still, I see some good folks who are still pushing concepts of Christianity, and they're conscious people, and it's mind-blowing. The African response to this development was influenced by the reward system and the incentives provided by the acquisition of the new educational provision. However, even during the initial period of Western education, Africans continued to appreciate the basic values of traditional education, which emphasized the inclusion of all and the pursuit of excellence. They therefore rejected all the attempts to adapt the educational system and provide what was perceived as an inferior type of education. With the attainment of political independence, various countries in Africa continued with the indigenous practice of inculcating moral and ethical values in the learners and making education respond to the communal and social needs of the society. See that part there? That's what you need in your education. The development of a more appropriate problem-solving educational curriculum and the promotion of lifelong education. This is what I'm talking about. Frankly, any curriculum for a child that's not good enough to teach an adult is not a good curriculum. You understand? Any curriculum, so like what we see going on out here in the public school system, once these children get to a certain grade, a lot of parents just can't deal with the subject matter. So the student is completely left on their own. And I grew up kind of like that too. My grandparents didn't go beyond primary school, really. So when I was in grade 9 and 10 doing chemistry, and they couldn't help me. So that's why I'm saying, like, the way the lessons need to be taught, they need to be taught the way where the adult can grasp it as well as the child can grasp it. And the adult being an adult and having years of experience and hopefully the ability to rationalize and think through things and problem solve, they can actually bridge the gap of misunderstanding that the child might have when it comes to the knowledge base in the curriculum. To continue. However, efforts to Africanize the curriculum in the 1960s following the independence euphoria did not yield lasting benefits to the people of Africa. This is particularly true of the efforts made towards establishing education for self-reliance in Tanzania, authenticity in Zaire, African Renaissance in South Africa, and the whole movement of Africanization of the curriculum in several countries, including Kenya, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Guinea, Cape Verde, and so on. There is therefore the need to revisit the issue of Africanizing the curriculum with a view of ensuring the contextualization of learning, which occurs where the content of the curriculum and the methods and materials associated with it are related directly to the experience and environment to the learner. And again, this is where Booker T. Washington, as I've read to you in the past in different papers, this is where Booker T. Washington was so spot on, right? Like, it makes no sense. Any curriculum that just teaches you facts or has you memorizing facts, but then you don't get to then turn around and apply that information, that knowledge, it is a wasted curriculum. There's no value to that, right? And the things that you turn around and you're doing has to be things that are there's some problem in your immediate environment. You want to shape the environment to benefit you and your people, your community. It has to be that kind of learning. For example, if you live around a river and the river swells every year and floods the land around it for yards, right, or hundreds of yards or whatever, and people's livelihood, their home lives are disrupted by this flooding, right? And you are in a school in the vicinity of where this problem is happening, and you're not learning what can we do to circumvent this problem going forward. If you're not learning that stuff in that school, again, it's a waste of time. It's a waste of time. And, a part of the reason why this is not, because this is common sense, but a part of the reason why this is not a thing, why this doesn't happen, is because, we as African folks, we tend to just want to wait for others to fix these problems for us. We've got, again, this is what the curriculum or the education would do. The education will embolden you to want to fix your own problems. You see? It would embolden you to want to fix your own problems. And so this is why we're losing. This is why we're behind. Our education is just rotten. It doesn't motivate us to want to do anything for self, or to do very little for self. Your education is supposed to train you to manipulate the environment around you, right? To help and to save and to uplift the community that you're from. And if it ain't doing that, if you just go in and memorizing Pythagoras theorem and then you never use it, that's a wasted education. Now we get to the section called Characteristics of Traditional African Education. There is no doubt that Africans who live on or outside the continent are undergoing profound transformations, and so are their knowledge systems and practices changing. Their ways of knowing continue to be transformed by diversity in colonial experience, religion, customs, and languages, and penetrated by outside forces, including current globalization efforts. In spite of this situation, it is still important and pertinent to revisit these characteristics in order to show how indigenous knowledge not only preserves the past, but can also be vital through its enduring process to ensure a sustainable future for the African people. Although Africans do not have the same and equal educational experience in traditional ways of knowing, it would not be out of place to describe the basic characteristic of traditional education in Africa as that which is intimately integrated with the social, cultural, political, occupational, artistic, religious, and recreational life of the people. Your education, in other words, is supposed to immerse you in yourself, in your people, So when you're out here, like in America, right, the education immerses them into white folks' culture and outlook and, etc. Including especially religion, right? And so when you see the folks in America, bickering and, attacking immigrants, black immigrants here and there, that's because the education, right? They're getting their education from white folks. Their outlook is from white, their cultural and their social outlook is from white folks. When you listen to Tariq Nasheed over the last few years, Tariq Nasheed has become exactly like Alex Jones. He is the black Alex Jones now, right? And he can only get away with it because the fans allow him to get away with it. If fans held him accountable, he couldn't get away with it. But the problem is the fans are also educated under this white system of education in America. So what you're starting to see, unfortunately, is like there's a lot of low-key contempt that's been held by, black Americans towards black, Africans from the Caribbean and the continent. And grifters like Tariq and Black Authority and all these guys are promoting it. And I've talked about why they would do that in the past, so I won't rethread that conversation. But it comes from the reason why they could get these people to follow in the foolishness. The folks here, especially, and I'm not saying it's not true in the Caribbean because we have our own biases and this, that, and the other, right? But here it's definitely from a white perspective here. It is usually stored in people's memories and activities, and it's expressed in stories, songs, folklore, proverbs, dances, myths, cultural values, beliefs, rituals, community laws, local language, and taxonomy. Agricultural practices, equipment, materials, plant species, and animal breeds. And, that's the thing, too. Like, I think we talked about this also with Dr. Campbell. Like, there's power in naming. There's power in the name you call yourself. There's power in the name that you give to things around you. When you look at, like, the English language, as per our conversation, it's a mix of Latin, German, there's Spanish, French, right? There's all these different cultures, these cultural terms, right? In the English language. You see? When you look at the names of, like, let's say you take a botany class, and you look at the names of certain plant species or crops or whatever, it's a white person who named that stuff. There's a power in that. Right? But when you go back to what we named stuff before these foreigners, came into our mix, that's the power that we need to be on. It's that Sankofa thinking of, going back and bringing forward. We got to go back and bring it forward. Like the good doctor talked about, like, calling yourself African is even a little bit problematic. Because when you go back to the original name Kemet, which means land of the blacks, it's telling you what we're calling Africa. It's telling you what that land is for or who it's for. So there's power in these names. There's power in words. And we gotta start accessing the proper terminology, proper words to get that power. Traditional African education is always used as the information base for the community, which facilitates communication and decision making. An important aspect of traditional African education is the acquisition of knowledge, where everyone is taught different things like the identification of various gods, the planting seasons, good soil and harvest methods, herbs and fishing methods. Traditional African education is usually generated within the communities. It is based on practical common sense, on teachings and experience, and it is holistic. It cannot be compartmentalized and cannot be separated from the people who are involved in it, because essentially it is a way of life. And again, Booker T. Washington was doing just that with what he did over 100 years ago with the Tuskegee Institute. In traditional African education, efforts are made to ensure that every person develops a set of skills. In the process, provisions is made for learning and training centers for the apprenticeship system, during which the apprentice is introduced into the craft and skill of the chosen profession. There is provision for graduation and certification of competence on the completion of the apprenticeship. However, the end of apprenticeship does not signify the end of learning. And that's a problem that we have too. We get our degrees or what have you, and that's it. Indeed, continuing education through observation, self-improvement, and search for wisdom is a lifelong process. The apprentice does not, however, just learn the skill of the master. He or she also learns obedience, patience, and industry. He or she learns how to respect the master and the senior apprentices and pays dearly for failure to conform. Through a system of taboos and sanctions, every member of the society appreciates the danger of failing to conform. And you know, something they say here that really jumps out at me. As you guys know, I teach a college class. And what I'm seeing as the years go by more and more is students, especially these European students, do not understand the concept of obedience, patience, and you know, respect the master, right? And conform. In other words, do what you got to do to get along and get through this process of learning. And that's an opportunity for Africans. If we were to get back to this type of paradigm, right, where the apprentice not just learns the skill of the master, but also learns kind of to be humble, right, obedient, patient, be industrious, like you know, even do greater things than the master, right? Learn to respect the master and all the senior apprentices and all that kind of stuff. Learn to conform. That's our opportunity to get ahead of these beasts. That's the thing. See, we're sleeping on our opportunity here. Their children are not about it. They're so used to getting the hookup, and you know, we saw the scandal with those actresses who were paying, you know, which was a racket, by the way, right? And they gave those white women slaps on the wrists, right? Because it was dudes who were taking money, taking tests, and changing stuff, and that's a racket, right? That's not just payola, that's a racket. And so, you know, they're doing this kind of stuff. This is what they've been doing for some time, but now, at least at one time, there was a certain amount of I hate to use the word brilliance, but there was a certain amount of knowledge that they used to attain at one time. Their children now are not looking to attain that. They're just out here trying to get the hookup and get pushed through, and that's how they succeed. We have this is such a great time that if we get our children and ourselves as adults to follow what's highlighted here, if we could do that, we will overtake these beasts in a generation. Traditional African education uses the age grade system in which those about the same age are brought together to share responsibilities, work together, and be introduced to activities that will not be burdensome for their grade. The entry of each grade involves initiation, during which the initiated person is made to appreciate the degree of responsibility, accountability, and privilege of the process into which he or she is being initiated. All right. What was the last initiation process your children went through? In Africa, learning is not expected to end in the grave. The Yoruba, for instance, believe that learning continues after death. In the warning, and I cannot read it, but I guess in parentheses it says, do not eat worms or millipedes, but carefully adopt the practices in your new abode. So don't just die and rot, right? Wherever you are in death, keep learning. The Yoruba encourage the dead to cultivate the values and abide by the practices of those beyond the grave. This is a unique development in the educational practices of societies, which emphasize the duration of learning only from the cradle to the grave. Goals of traditional education in Africa. The major goal of traditional education in Africa is to produce a complete individual, a lifelong learner who is cultured, respectful, integrated, sensitive, and responsive to the needs of the family and the neighbors. This should be made into a poster. It is aimed at inculcating attitudes and values capable of integrating the individual into the wider society. The ultimate objective is to produce a person guided by wisdom. The product is thus expected to be confident in spite of circumstances that emerge. The personal satisfaction derived from this is expected to serve as a buffer against all temptations and trials. African traditional education is focused on the attainment of quality education with centers of excellence that are recognized and profoundly appreciated by the stakeholders of the educational systems. For centuries, traditional education has provided Africa's tribal peoples with practical solutions to the problems of a fluctuating climate. As an example, the Maasai pastoralists of northern Tanzania and southern Kenya traditionally know where to find water and green shrubs that can be fed to young calves even during long periods of drought. Likewise, in Ethiopia, often regarded as inevitably dependent on Western aid, the threat of famine was overcome by local expertise, as Warede in Seabrook 1993 explains. Traditional African education encourages the acquisition and sharing of knowledge in diverse forms. For example, the Maasai and the Barabeg, alike of northern Tanzania, have developed and maintained traditional knowledge and practices for the management and conservation of the biological resources on which they depend. Their knowledge and practices are empirical, based on continuous observations and their close attachment to and utter dependence on natural resources. The knowledge is stored in cultural and religious beliefs, taboos, folklore, myths, as much as in the individual's practical experience. Knowledge is imparted in youth through a phased childhood and adolescence. This contributes to a stock of knowledge in human and animal health, in agricultural, meteorology, and in land use. A combination of cultural, empirical, and hierarchical methods ensures the safeguarding and further development of knowledge, as well as the effectiveness of existing practices. By favoring utilitarian to hierarchical or theoretical concepts, knowledge is much more easily shared. In essence, traditional African educational systems are often application-oriented. The children of the farmer or the nomadic herdsman learn the business of producing food crops or of keeping cattle from their parents. Similarly, the artisan, the craftsman, or the drummer teaches his offspring, although he may take an apprentice who are not members of his family. There is therefore little or no problem about access to the acquisition of most kinds of available knowledge, skills, or training, even though specialist educational institutions exist. These include those for initiating adolescents into puberty and quasi-religious cults, as well as into the various age grades of those societies in which such grades exist. Finally, there are periodic conferences in which practitioners like traditional doctors, like the Yoruba Babalawo, or the Bantu Mganga, diviners, master craftsmen, and members of esoteric guilds meet to exchange ideas. And that's something I talked about a while ago. Like, where are our research journals? Where are, you could find some, I've been reading some of them, but there should be more. And they should be tackling more solutions than they previously have been. Modes of traditional African education. Traditional African education is passed from one generation to another by learning through various modes, which include language, music, dance, oral tradition, proverbs, myths, stories, culture, religion, and elders. Others include learning through specialists, specific names, the holistic approach, integrating theory and practice in traditional African science and technology. Let us now briefly describe how each mode operates to foster learning amongst participants. This should be good. Let me just check the stream. Stream seems to be good. Okay. Looked like a few people hopped in and then hopped out. That's fine. So, learning through language. Language is an important element in the training of the child, and no one is considered adequately trained without considerable mastery of the use of language for effective communication. Using the mother tongue, learners are actually introduced very early to the system of manipulating figures involving counting, adding, and subtracting, right? Which just makes sense. Learning through music and dance. Music and dance are fundamental to the African way of life. They are introduced to equip the learner with the ability to function effectively in other areas of learning, such as language acquisition, speech therapy, literacy, numeracy, and other related themes. They are given to learners to enjoy, thus providing them with an artistic outlet and a way to relax. Learners often anticipate the music and dance sessions with excitement because creativity and choice are usually encouraged and nurtured. And that's really funny, because outside of the continent, you would have to say that the Caribbean is closer to continental ways than, say, here in the US. And the truth of the matter is, because of our own miseducation, the creativity is oftentimes kind of refused or put down. We're taught to, push to be a lawyer, a doctor, a businessman, a nurse, perhaps a teacher, and there's like a hierarchy here too, by the way. And outside of that, to go to like a Caribbean parent and say, "Hey, I'm going to go to college to learn music. Or to major in music, major in guitar or something, you will get chewed out for something like that. Like, that's a no-no, right? To say that I'm gonna grow up and be an artist is like a no-no, right? And I dealt with that person. So it's funny to read this, to see that, this is the traditional African way and how we've kind of deviated from this. And again, it's because of the miseducation. Right? And I'm sure in Africa, too, there's been miseducation. I'm sure a lot of, because in fact, this is talking about traditional. Yeah, this is talking about modes of traditional. So yeah, in traditional African education, yeah, the creativity was embraced, but now through the miseducation that we kind of have continued to allow to go on, that's not really true anymore. Through carefully planned music and dance programs, learning takes place during initiation, festivities, the age grade system, home education, and community education, where everyone is encouraged to learn the norms and values of the society. And, I want to add something here, too, because I saw this come up recently. I mentioned it earlier about we need to engage in more propaganda. Well, if you want to engage in propaganda, the thing that you do is essentially a lot of what we're talking about here in terms of the modes of education. You put out propaganda songs, you put out propaganda folklore, right? Propaganda short stories, right? That's how you put out propaganda. Look at, like, one of the greatest bits of propaganda you'll find is the Willie Lynch letter. Now we know, most of us know there wasn't a Willie Lynch, right? Somebody, right, wrote that thing, but it's a great propaganda piece, because once it started to get out there, then a bunch of us black folks, we latched onto that. You can't go a year without hearing a group of black folks talk about the Willie Lynch letter and how true it is, etc. Right? So that's how you carry out propaganda, right? Oral tradition using proverbs, myths, and stories. Again, these are great ways of creating a positive propaganda for black folks going forward. The most significant information gathering exercise for the traditional African mode of education is the oral tradition, namely the collective testimonies and recollections of the past inherited from earlier generations and transmitted in various forms of verbal testimonies. Oral tradition continues to be a reservoir of inexhaustible wisdom where Africans learn about their origin, history, culture, and religion, about the meaning and reality of life, about morals, norms, and survival techniques. I like this whole paragraph. Orally transmitted information inherited from past generations may be shared in both structured and unstructured contexts. It constitutes a major resource which has been classified by many different scholars. Because most African societies have oral, non-literary traditions, they have succeeded in developing complicated and beautiful webs of eyewitness account, idioms, legends, folklore, stories, proverbs, and myths for all conceivable circumstances. In Africa, proverbs are embellishments of speech, right? They are symbols of communication, and in many cases, they form sub-languages of their own. The language of proverbs gives vent to a whole perspective on the world, and thus constitutes a means of tapping into society's view of reality. Proverbs are spurs to knowledge, wisdom, and morality. They can be prognostic. They can be prognostic and can challenge assumptions in order to inspire further reflection. They serve as a warning in all areas of human activities or relations. They criticize, praise, advise, and teach. In Africa, proverbs cover every aspect of human endeavor and human relations, and thus there is hardly any African imbued to any measure with the culture of his or her people who has not a good stock of proverbs for ready application. Though, like in all things, expertise and refinement in their use vary widely. Proverbs are rich sources of African wisdom and philosophy. Africans use proverbs extensively. These are usually expressed not only in words, but also in the language of the drums and the sound of the horns blown by the attendants of chiefs. Proverbs convey how to treat people with respect, dignity, and empathy and kindness. They enshrine wisdom, beliefs, and the accumulated experiences of past and present generations. In most African traditional cultures, the use of proverbs is a common feature of African religion. The entire worldview of the people is rooted within proverbs and wise sayings, and many of these proverbs govern religious and social behavior. A myth is a vehicle conveying a certain fact or a certain basic truth about many experiences in this encounter with the created order and with regard to man's relation to the supra-sensible world. Myths seek to explain what brought about the present uncomfortable order and to indicate that man is destined to overcome the present discomfort. Structurally, a myth is timeless, peopled by extraordinary figures, and enjoys general acceptance in the culture in which it originates. Myths provide the cultural and social history of the African people. They tell how some things came into being and talk of supernatural beings. They are the stories of a people's origin and religion. They are stories, the product of fertile imagination, sometimes simple, often containing profound truths. Myths are not meant to be taken too literally, right? However, most of them express serious beliefs about human beings, eternity, and God. Myth serves as a language depicting truths or realities for which history does not provide a full explanation. They are the way a society expresses its traditions, heritage, and worldview in its own language. Myths provide the fuel that maintains the systems which govern African societies. The purpose of mythology is more than explanatory. Coach explains the purposes of African mythology in context as follows. African mythology acts as a socializing agent. It is used to nourish and continue the traditions of the elders or ancestors. The morals, the norms, the conventions, customs, and manners are part of the myth, right? So you could use myths to identify a people. Again, you want to name yourself, you want to self-identify. Number 2, education is another function of the myth, teaching people, especially the youngsters, the meaning of the universe and those things which belong to it. 3, the myth provides emotional and psychological easement by pointing toward the redeeming features in what appears to be a bad situation. 4, the African myth is entertainment and may become a part of drama, art, and of skill. The African mythologist or his students seeks to employ all forms of theatrical skill and to put to use every faculty in his delivery. The story is a primary form of oral tradition used in conveying culture, experience, values, knowledge, and wisdom. The stories inculcate values and the advantages of correct attitudes of honesty, integrity, accountability, and transparency in everyday dealings. Traditionally, Africans have revered good stories and storytellers. Smith has described the uses of stories as educative devices in traditional African societies. Stories are used not only to amuse and express feelings, but also to teach ideal forms of behavior and morality. Children learn by listening to their elders, imitating or emulating them. These stories are usually handed down from one generation to the next. Their main concern is to induct the youth into the moral, philosophical, and cultural values of the community. Learning through culture. Before we do learning through culture, let me do a little break here for station identification.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
All right, and we're back. And we're continuing the reading. Make sure, guys, to follow everything on the podcast network, KWAZ Radio. That's a pro-black perspective, Queen's Council, and the Harsh Reality Podcast. Make sure you follow all of those. They're all different shows from Minds, all very interesting, and we might have something special cooking for you guys in the near future. So, learning through culture. Culture is everything that characterizes a society, such as language, technological artifacts, skills, knowledge, beliefs, art, morals, attitudes, ideas, behavior, laws, traditions, customs, and values. It is a basis of identity, which largely determines how people view reality. It functions as a lens of perception, influencing how people view themselves and their environment. For example, African cultural concepts of immorality have influenced attitudes to family size and population growth. Many Africans believe that no person is really dead for as long as the person's blood flows in the veins of the living. That's a personal belief of mine. It is therefore rational to maximize one's genetic legacy by having many children. And that's the basis of biology. Like the idea of any sex is to produce progeny, right, that allows them to live on into the next generation. And I've talked about this a long time ago about plants. You'll see a plant growing up in a crack of concrete, and it'll look good for a while, but as those resources that it needs starts to deplete, you see the plant grows a shoot or a flower or something like that. And that plant, the idea there is that plant wants to send out its genetic material, right, via spores or pollen or what have you, right? It's gametophyte. It wants to send that out and live on into a next generation, right? That's just what we're supposed to do if you want to keep living. So our ancestors live through us. We are our ancestors, and we just don't realize it. We're out here talking about I'm not my ancestor. You are your ancestor. It's in the DNA. It is important to note that culture in traditional Africa can be seen as a spring of motivation, standard of judgment, basis of stratification, means of communication, patterns of production and consumption. Traditional African education is therefore stored in culture in various forms, such as traditions, customs, folk stories, folk songs, folk dramas, legends, proverbs, myths, etc. And again, these are the things that we need to engage more, right? When we talk about consciousness, we got to engage, these these modalities. We have to engage these more if we want to spread a culture of consciousness or Pan-Africanism or, whatever it is. The use of these various forms of cultural items as resources in teaching and learning can be very effective in bringing traditional African education alive for the learners. It allows them to conceptualize places and issues not only in the local area, but also beyond their immediate experience. Learners who are already familiar with some aspects of traditional cultures usually find it interesting to learn more about it through these cultural forms. It also enables active participation as teachers involve learners in collecting folk stories, folk songs, legends, proverbs, etc., that are retold in their community. Use of these cultural items in schools as resources or tools for environmental education can be very effective in bringing the environment alive for the learners. Learners are already familiar with their culture, and therefore they would find it interesting to learn about the environment through these cultural forms. It would enable the teachers to get the learners' active participation in teaching about the environment, as teachers could ask pupils to collect folk stories, folk songs, legends, proverbs, etc., existing in the community, which have potential value for environmental education. Learning through religion. Because the African has remained incurably religious. I like that word that they use there. The young child is introduced very early to the spiritual world of the ancestors and the supreme being, the creator of the universe, etc. Music, dance, and art are expressions of religion and a celebration of creation. The fear of God is carefully taught, and everyone is encouraged to recognize the presence and continuing activity of the supreme being, who is considered always there to monitor one's activities, motives, and intentions. To ignore that presence is considered a crime against oneself and the wider society that has activities related to his celebration. In Nigeria, the Yoruba describe a well-educated person as an omoluwabi, one that has been shaped in the image of the Creator himself and can therefore be trusted and fully appreciated as dependable and sensitive to the needs of others. Thus, for example, young men and women are taught good morals and the resolve to flee from such crimes as theft, adultery, use of foul language, and violence. So I'm not a religious person, but I did grow up in the church. And I do have a personal concept of God. And one thing I would give the church its credit for, I've always felt like the sermons were good for children. At one time, in fact, I was looking into sermon writing for these podcast episodes before I started doing these readings, when I was doing topics, because I do believe that the sermon, because the sermon has, the concept of morality and stuff built in to them, like usually a good sermon is a story or several stories, like the church will call them parables and stuff, that have a moral concept to them that I do believe is good for children. I don't believe in all the other stuff that's done in the church, but that one thing has always remained with me. I always think it's a good thing, and so I give religion props for that. I'm not sure if this author is talking about religion in terms of the European religion. I'm hoping it's still being, I guess this is still part of the traditional modes of African education. So I guess he's talking about traditional African religion. Learning from elders, something I did a lot. African traditional education encourages everyone to respect elders, to accept the values sanctioned by the ancestors, to be honest and dedicated, and to be loyal. Traditional leaders, because of their moral and religious authority, can influence their communities in achieving development goals that necessitate behavioral change. In most African cultures, the elderly are accorded a great deal of respect. African culture teaches this to gain. African cultures teaches that to gain long life, to be wise, and to be blessed and protected, one must respect not only the elders of one's own family, but also those of the society. In general, older people are addressed using a title of respect and not by their ordinary names. The child is taught social courtesies. She learns how to greet people with appropriate gestures, to show respect, to establish good relationships, and to thank someone for a good deed. Children are encouraged to express their appreciation and respect by giving gifts. You know, that makes me think of something that I think about all the time. You know how you could have a cousin who's really like your second cousin or something like that. They're more so like your parents' first cousin, or sometimes even your grandparents' first cousin. So they're your cousin. But because of the age gap, because you're a child and this is an adult, you know, we were taught in my part of the Caribbean, we were taught you don't just refer to Gloria as Gloria. Even though she's your cousin, you call her cousin Gloria. Like the cousin was there as a title of to show some respect. Yeah, you're older than me. Yeah, we're really just cousins, but I still cannot just call you Gloria. And to this day, I cannot call her Gloria. She's cousin Gloria forever. In a non-literate society, accumulated knowledge and wisdom is stored in the heads of the adult members of the society. As Key Zerbo in 1990 argued, when an old African passes away, it is a whole library which disappears. Parents, older relatives, and others play a very important part in the lifelong learning process of the individual. And that's the thing, man. Like, this is where we're failing now, too. A lot of our people who are adults, like on social media and stuff, are not learners. They're not studying. They're not reading anything of value. And so how do you expect them to produce intelligent children that will carry the torch into the future? We got to change. As adults, we got to change. Go back and listen to the episode I did a few weeks back about the profile of an Afrocentric teacher. Now, that was talking about a teacher, but I think we all should have those characteristics, right? There's certain things we as adults need to have, you know, and frankly, they should be basic things. If we don't have it, we can't expect our children to have it. Wherever possible, however, the focus is on learning within the home environment. This helps to close the generation gaps that so often result from formal education. Rather than despising older relatives for their illiteracy, learners are expected to recognize the elders as holders of valuable knowledge and to acknowledge their contributions at the back of the completed workbook. In addition to their role in teaching, community elders are also included in the assessment process. Everyone is taught the value of respect for elders and reverence for old age. For example, the practice amongst the Mossi of Burkina Faso, which is typical of African communities, demands that elders be addressed in the plural tense. The entire community is expected to learn how to behave towards one another. The society is also encouraged to pay special attention to strangers and visitors whom they are to welcome warmly with open hands, and whose immediate needs are to be met until they have been fully integrated into the new society. Now, they need to put a cap on this stuff when it comes to these white foreigners. The African learns always to be inclusive and believes in the saying, the more the merrier, because the human race began with a single family. Failure to produce a well-rounded, complete gentleman or gentlewoman is considered a shortcoming of the home, and such a deficit is ascribed to the Nigerian home in the Yoruba statement, "A lai le ko il," i.e., one without home training. And you'll hear that a lot from Caribbean, from black folks, period. You'll hear black folks talk about people. This man don't have no home training, man. Learning through specialists. There are specialists who teach various skills. Some homes specialize in specific professions. The Ayan, for example, represents a family of drummers in Yoruba land. Amongst the Igbo, there are the traditional medical practitioners, the Ime Ogu, known as the Babalawo amongst the Yoruba. There are those who specialize in divination, while in Edo state of Nigeria, some families are known for surgical work and the healing of compound fractures. The Igba, or the Iba Efe, would be that group. Other prominent specialists in traditional African education are gold and ironsmith, skin workers, weavers, woodworkers, spirit mediums, specialists in medicine, witchcraft practitioners, psychiatrists, healers, circumcisers, musicians, storytellers, historians, etc. These specialized teachers are so much involved with their particular subject that it is not just a profession or a means of economic survival. It is an integral part of their lives and the lives of their clans. Teaching takes place during a long process of apprenticeship, during which the learner submits himself and devotes his service completely to the teacher. There is supposed to be a mutual trust and understanding between the teacher and the learner. The knowledge handed down by non-specialized and specialized teachers is normally relevant and appropriate to the learner. The learning process here happens by doing, living, and experiencing the subject matter. As much as it seems to be more natural and thus less boring, both the learner and instructor have a direct interest in the success of the process. Now we get to learning through specific names. Africans learn also through specific names, which often reflect the baby's circumstances at the time of birth. These include ancestral, spirit, proverbial, birth-related, and special names. Ancestral names are those names that are given to newborn babies in recognition and remembrance of the boldness, wisdom, and status of a long-departed ancestor. Both the living and the dead constitute the extended families. The ancestors are the invisible protectors of the living descendants who usually guard, direct, and exercise a disciplinary influence over the family affairs, traditional ethics, and social relationships with the community they had left behind. That's why I say you are your ancestors. And this type of stuff, again, you saw this heavily in the Caribbean. All of my father and his siblings, most of their names, their first names, came from some uncle or aunt that they had from either my grandmother or grandfather's side. My children are named in part after like my grandfather and their mom's grandfathers, etc. Right? That's a very African tradition. In most African communities, children are named after the ancestors and heroes of their community. In Nigeria, the Yoruba name Onipede, or Onipede, which means a child born after the death of an important person in the family, is an example of an ancestral name. Spirit names are names of deities and objects. The sadistic mischief of some wandering spirits usually highlighted by the name of the bearer. This is marked by a discussion of superstitious beliefs and the significance and effect of ethnic facial marks. In Nigeria, the Yoruba may call on the god Ogun in troubled times and when a child is conceived as a consequence of Ogun's mediation. He may be called Ogunwale, which means Ogun has come back home. Isn't it funny, like guys like Tariq and them, and again, this is where black folks get caught up in these like catchphrases and stuff like that. You know, like JJ, you know, Jimmy Walker back in the day with dynamite. Like we love a catchphrase, man. And so like, you know, or Urkel, did I do that? And Tariq and these guys, they use that psychology against you guys, man. You know, so Tariq will talk all this shit about Africans and Caribbean folks and all that stuff, and then sit up here and still talk about Ogun. That ain't nothing but Ogun. Like, well, make up your mind. Are you African or are you not? Mines is even selling Ogun juice, which I'm afraid to know where it comes from. In addition, believers of the Sango deity amongst the Yoruba may express gratitude to him by naming their child Sango Bunmi, meaning given to me by Sango. The parents may have appealed to Sango for the birth of the child, and the spirit of Sango graciously obliged. Proverbial names usually confirm the fact that anything that is authentically African is underscored by a proverb or an adage. This is borne out by some African personal names and the response they generate. There are also names that allude to a story about the family. The structure of the indigenous names enables us to learn something about the language and literature of the society. In Nigeria, the Yoruba name Mose Bolatan, which means I think my wealth has finished, belongs to the category of proverbial names. Birth-related names include names of twins and their siblings, names based on the days of the week, and names delineating the rank of the family's children. Names such as Kofi, born on Friday in Akan, Ghana, Kwasi, born on a Sunday in Akan, Ghana, all refer to the day when the child was born. Special names are names that do not fall readily into any of the above categories: geographical names, titulate names, occupational names, etc. Special names from Uganda include Kabito, born while foreigners are visiting, Kamuhanda, born on the way to the hospital. In Nigeria, the Yoruba have special names like Yetunde, Yewande, and Ayaba, meaning the mother has come back. This usually means a female child was born after an elderly woman in the family recently died. This is interesting stuff, man. The power in naming stuff, right? It's the power in naming stuff. Learning through a holistic approach. Traditional education is not compartmentalized into disciplines, but highly integrated. Every occasion and happening may be used to teach one lesson or another. The holistic approach to traditional African education preaches the doctrine of multiple learning. Omowale in 1981 illustrates this vividly with what happens amongst the Acholi of Uganda, where in teaching a child how to build a house, the child would simultaneously learn about the selection strategic location, pardon me, soil types, grass types, wood types, including their resistance to ants, etc. The girl learning to cook would learn simultaneously serving vegetable types, preparatory procedures, the general welfare system, fuel, wood types, etc. And again, this is exactly what Booker T was doing at the Tuskegee Institute. If you remember, I read this passage in a paper that talked about how, like, there was a conversation with the kids. They were supposed to be building like a sidewalk or a deck or something. And that conversation turned into, in talking about how to proceed with this work, the conversation turned into, pricing, figuring out pricing for materials, turned into how much they could make per hour once they're done with this school stuff and they're out into the world. Like, it's expansive. You're not just learning how to build the deck, but you're learning everything that goes into building the deck, like the cost, to use this example, the soil type underneath the deck, all that kind of stuff. And that's what we need to encourage. I talked about this before, but in the education system out here now, kids will be doing these science subjects, for example, and they'll learn about the chemical structure of DNA in one class and not realize that those same nitrogens and carbons and all that, hydrogens, are the same things that you're working with in chemistry when you're studying chemical reactions. The same thing you learn when you're studying chemical reactions about two reactants coming into contact with or without a catalyst to produce a product is the same thing that you learn in physics, thermodynamics, etc. Right? So we have to encourage that our children become multiple learners, because when you're a multiple learner, you learn the area of knowledge even better. You see? The holistic approach as a strategy for teaching and learning is valid because the learner is liberated from the authoritarianism of the teacher, the curriculum, and the institution. Read that again. The holistic approach as a strategy for teaching and learning is valid because the learner is liberated from the authoritarianism of the teacher, the curriculum, and the institution. Okay. The learner through this approach is free to develop self-discipline, engage in self-directed learning, and self-fulfillment. A little bit thirsty here now. Learners share their personal experiences and views relating to the themes of the discourse: history, culture, environment, and health. They are encouraged to build self-esteem and to ensure that new information is placed in familiar context. Ideas are exchanged in an environment of open-mindedness and willingness to listen, with an emphasis on what the different ethnic, religious, and national groups can learn from one another. And, that self-esteem, I talked about that as well in recent weeks. That raising the esteem is so powerful. And again, it's through education that you could raise the esteem of these young kids and of yourselves. The more you know, the taller you walk. But you've been convinced that education, or that the educated Negro, is a self-serving Negro. That's not necessarily the case. Given the proper African-centered education, your future leaders will be invested in African communities. But what happened, and I'm going to use the talented 10th as the example here, and again, I'm going to talk about Tariq and them who keep, using this term boule. Oh, those is boule, this, that, and the other. Those are, they down with links and the boule, and they keep repeating this stuff over and over till now. You have a disdain for the educated, for the intellectual blacks around you. And this is why you guys follow Tariq and them. But the failings of the talented 10s is not a failing of being educated or intellectual. The failing is from whom did you get your education? And that's what Booker T messed up. Not realizing that most of these folks, by the time they go through, and I talked about this just a couple weeks ago, by the time they go through the process of education, they're centered, they're in the midst of Eurocentric culture. That's the problem. It's not the problem of the talented 10. You want your most intelligent leading the race. Learning by integrating theory and practice. Learning by integrating theory and practice addresses interdisciplinary explorations of how traditional Africans know what they want to know with regard to modes of inquiry in the arts, humanities, social sciences, and sciences, and their application in their day-to-day lives. It addresses how people learn from the past and identifies current approaches for critical thinking in their respective endeavors. It gives learners the opportunity to assess their learning and reflect upon that learning in relationship to current and future practice and towards the development of their future careers. Learners have to complete some practical tasks such as medicinal plant identification, construction of a material object relevant to his or her ethnic group, performance of a traditional song, performance of a dance on a drum routine, and preparation of a local dish. This was stuff that we did in school back home. In addition, they should explain their cultural significance. These tasks must be carried out to the satisfaction of community elders. Learning through traditional African science and technology. This should be interesting. Africa has a relatively rich body of related science and technologies. This is embodied in the continent's cultural and ecological diversities and has been used by the African people for thousands of years to solve specific developmental and environmental problems. Traditional education and technologies play major roles in biodiversity conservation, sustainable use, and prospecting. In addition, their contributions to increasing food production, fighting HIV/AIDS and other diseases, and stemming environmental degradation are considerable. African leaders have recognized and stressed the importance of protecting and promoting traditional education and technologies to solve specific problems and improve the continent's economies. Paragraphs 140 and 141 of the New Partnership for Africa's Development, the NEPAD, framework document are devoted to the protection and promotion of traditional education and related technological innovations. Paragraph 140 states, culture is an integral part of development efforts of the continent. Consequently, Africans protect and effectively utilize traditional education to share this knowledge for their benefits. In Africa, there exists traditional indigenous knowledge related to the health of humans and animals. In Uganda, for instance, traditional healers and herbal plant remedies play an important role in the health of millions of people. Africa as a whole has a long and impressive list of medicinal plants based on local knowledge. African health practitioners are devoted to teaching individuals how to improve their physical, mental, and spiritual health through traditional knowledge. Seldom documented, African traditional knowledge in healthcare is passed orally from generation to generation. The African Traditional Herbal Research Clinic is a modern clinic facility located in Bukoto in Uganda. It was created to establish a model space whereby traditional herbal practitioners and healers can upgrade and update their skills through training and certification and learn to respond to common and uncommon diseases using African healing methods and traditions in a modern clinical environment. Their knowledge has been passed on by oral tradition. So where I'm from, in the Caribbean, in fact, the whole Caribbean has it. I don't know if they all call it the same thing, but where I'm from, we call it bush medicine. And bush medicine is one of the biggest projects you could do at the end of junior secondary education. You could do other things, like earlier I read off some things that you had to do in this paper for the approval of the elders, and a lot of it was those kinds of things that we did in school. People would do home ec, and they'd have to cook a dish and stuff like that. But I, for example, did bush medicine. And in my years in science, since leaving home, in my years in science, I've always wondered why we don't have as many folks as we should definitely have who are taking a clinical approach to bush medicine. So we had Dr. Sabi, may he rest in peace, who some of his methodologies do work, for sure. But, to me, it was, and this was, some of the criticisms they came after him with, it wasn't really done in a clinical manner, right? And so, every so often you'll see it on Facebook or something, the concept of the soursop seed having the ability to kill cancer. If I were still back home with the knowledge I have, I would definitely be doing research on this soursop seed. And so we're kind of missing that. In Kenya, there exists traditional indigenous knowledge related to the organic farming movement, which actively engages several groups, including non-governmental organizations. These include the Kenya Institute of Organic Farming, Manor House Agricultural Center, the Association for Better Land Husbandry, the Sustainable Agriculture Community Development Program, and the Kenya Organic Farmers Association. These organizations have formed networks that provide training and information to numerous allied grassroots groups, but some are also involved in production, processing, and marketing. To some extent, these NGOs have established geographic domains where they advocate organic agriculture in their respective part of the country. Organic agriculture in Kenya, which calls on all ways of farming to help inform new kinds of agriculture, has contributed immensely to the understanding of traditional ways of knowing and the conflictual nature of its coexistence with colonial or subjugated knowledge systems. This practice of farming prohibits the use of manufactured chemical inputs to crop and livestock production in favor of naturally occurring products and biological processes. By far, the bulk of organic farmers' knowledge is orally transmitted through workshops, presentations, and mentoring programs, farm tours, kitchen table meetings, and one-on-one conversations. Let me get some water before I continue. I apologize for that. I hate to have that dead air going on there. But doing this talking really does make you thirsty. So, we are at the section using traditional modes of education to contextualize teaching and learning in today's classrooms. You know what? Let me pause for a station break. I'll be right back in a moment.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
And we're back. We're going to finish up this reading in a few minutes. Once again, we're at the section of the reading called Using African Traditional Modes of Education to Contextualize Teaching and Learning in Today's Classrooms. There is a need for contextualization of teaching and learning to strengthen and develop the links between the learning environments of school, home, and community. This can be achieved by building on the learner's experience from outside of the school and providing additional experiences within the school program. This process is enhanced using the different African traditional modes of education, which allows learners to integrate their own learning experience with the school program. Agriculture, health, and indigenous science and technology may act as a unifying theme in order to achieve this. Curriculum planners therefore need to understand and appreciate variations in local knowledge by identifying unifying themes which can provide a direct link to the experience of most, if not all, of the learners in a particular area, and can be readily adapted through participative processes to fit each local situation. Examples of countries where an integrated approach to curriculum development has been carried out in Africa, and which in some cases have involved the contextualization of teaching and learning, include Cameroon, Ethiopia, and Zambia. This would be good to look into. In Cameroon, Bude, 1985, observed that primary schools in the Anglophone region have since the 60s attempted to use the local environment for the development of cognitive abilities, and also as the animation center for community development. In addition to using locally relevant experience, schools have also forged and developed strong links with their local communities by supplying various services, for example, agricultural advice to farmers. That's interesting. In Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Institute of Curriculum Development and Research described the development and trial of the general polytechnic curriculum in 70 pilot primary schools. And again, this is what you do. You don't just work on a curriculum in a vacuum. You have to put it out there, test it, and enough of a sample size that the results have meaning. And then you tweak, and you keep doing this until, you might never get it perfect, but you can get it where it's good. The use of local agricultural examples to facilitate learning in mathematics provides an illustration of this. This innovation, however, is no longer in operation under present government policy. In another development in Ethiopia, there is a poverty eradication action plan, where learners are made to see the world holistically, thus making meaning of their surroundings through appropriate connections. Learning takes place through the introduction of new information that meets the prior knowledge and experience of the learners. Learners come to school with knowledge from their homes, friends, environments, radio, etc. This knowledge is not necessarily broken up into math, mother tongue, natural science, social studies, etc. They come with knowledge and experiences that have meaning to them. Shelu and Mbulwe in 1994 described the Self-Help Action Plan for Education, SHAPE, in Zambia. One of the main aims of the program is to improve the quality and relevance of education. The program has tried to improve and strengthen certain types of learning, relating science, mathematics, and languages more to the local environment, developing a wider variety of skills, for example, literacy, numeracy, as well as practical problem-solving skills. Learners are made to develop individual potentialities, example, initiative, responsibility, creativity, developing positive attitudes, for example, towards work, local cultural traditions, preservation of natural resources, developing a healthy balance of learning and working to suit individual interests and future needs in order to achieve quality and relevance. The examples of contextualization for teaching and learning described above have implications for the school curriculum. The school will need to contribute towards deepening or fostering the apprehension of the cultural environment by endorsing its values for the socialization process and thus by integrating cultural manifestations into the learning content. Eisman, in '89, is of the view that the content of agricultural instruction and its articulation with instruction in modern science is particularly important. Also important is connecting instruction in modern science and modern agriculture to indigenous knowledge systems, building upon the knowledge and skills learners possess from social experience. Dewitt in '91 opines that since learning is an active construction process and can only take place based on previously acquired knowledge, learning has to do with constructing similarities between the new and the already known. Reed, Miller, and Mads are of the opinion that the handling of regular school subjects should be localized by relating the topics of the separate subject syllabi to the local environment. I agree. In this way, the subject is the point of origin. The environment then functions as a teaching aid to illustrate academic themes and to serve as a practical group for applying the acquired knowledge and skills. In order to accomplish the art of utilizing experience as a means of contextualizing in teaching and learning, there is the need to find ways of supporting teachers, both materially and psychologically, to enable and encourage them to develop new strategies and approaches that will facilitate the use of contextualization in the classroom. So like, when I talked about, Flint, Michigan, right? Imagine following, this type of modality for teaching, right? Where you could say to the student, look at the problem that you're dealing with at home with not having good water to drink or even to bathe in, if I'm not mistaken, right? There's also the problem of like even using this water for a shower, right? Look at that issue. And now you have that student thinking about that problem that they're facing every morning before coming into school and every night before going to bed. And if you want to start to run experiments, for example, on how to filter the water, how to filter the lead of the water, the water is right there in the immediate environment and community of the student. that student can go home and test, different approaches to, let's say, filtering out lead from water in their own home. It has more meaning. It is more impactful, right? So it's better to have like the instructions and all the subject matters. Again, going back to Booker T. Washington, right? If you're going to write an essay in English because you're learning how to write essays, then why not write an essay about the approaches you've been taking in your science class to tackling the Flint water crisis? So it's an integrated method of learning where all the subjects are interrelated, and the topic is, the general topics of the education is related to the immediate environment that these kids are in. So we've reached a conclusion now. Take a sip. In conclusion, perhaps the best way to preserve traditional education would be to integrate it into the school curriculum. In teaching any school subject, therefore, it is wise to start with the knowledge about the local area, which students are familiar with, and then gradually move to the knowledge about regional, national, and global environments. Amen to that. This essentially follows the philosophy of embarking on teaching and learning from the known to the unknown, which could be adopted if education is to be effective. In most societies, indigenous people have developed enormous volumes of knowledge over the centuries about different subject matters, especially in areas of informal and vocational training, which constitute the core of indigenous education in Africa. Under this traditional system, each person in the community is practically trained and prepared for his or her role in society. It is a holistic system in which storytelling, proverbs, and myths also play an important role. There is the need for the adoption of some of the elements of the system into modern-day educational practice as a strategy for improving quality. For example, it has been established that the indigenous community is a rich source of storytellers. Indigenous stories are therefore culturally and environmentally rich resource for teaching. To this end, schools could devise the strategies of using stories as teaching methods and categorizing them according to a range of themes in different subject areas. In doing this, different schools would need to consult and work together with indigenous people, the local leaders, parents, nurses, doctors, monks, nuns, priests, and other members of the community, by inviting them as guest storytellers or co-teachers to class to tell their stories, or to sing, act, dance, perform puppetry, etc., while developing the curriculum. This would encourage learners to learn from them and to appreciate and respect their knowledge. Such a relationship between young and older generations could help to mitigate the generation gap and help develop intergenerational harmony, something that we need. The integration of traditional education into school curriculum would thus enable schools to act as agencies for transferring the culture of the society from one generation to the next, and to explore the benefits of linking the learning process more closely to learners' everyday experience in order to help them to make better sense of what they learn. While the integration of indigenous knowledge into formal education offers many advantages, attempts to do so may encounter difficulties and challenges like the outcome-based education, OBE, of South Africa, which stipulates the knowledge, skills, values, and/or attitudes that an individual is expected to demonstrate in a given learning situation at the end of each learning process. The teacher's role might have to change from being a transmitter of knowledge to a mediator and facilitator of learning, which is what, this is me speaking now, which is what a teacher really should be, right? The expectation for the student would need to change from a passive receiver of knowledge to an autonomous learner, reflective thinker, and problem solver. This is what we need right here. You see, because this is what increases the engagement. The biggest problem, you talk to most teachers here, the Caribbean, wherever, is engagement. Because the way they're taught now is almost kind of abstract. It doesn't tie to their situation. Indigenous knowledge, which is increasingly disappearing with the death of older people who are the bearers of such knowledge, needs to be collected. Amen to that. Documented and made readily available for teachers. Like, you know, I remember when my grandmother was alive. She's been dead 20 odd years now. I remember when she was alive, we used to joke like, man, we gotta write down or record these stories you be telling us. And unfortunately, we didn't. I was a child. I was pretty young when that conversation was happening. And, you know, a lot of those stories, I mean, I remember them. I try to transmit them to my kids and other people around me. But it would have been nice to kind of done like a field recording and, you know, just write some of the stuff down. It must be emphasized at this juncture that the author is aware that the politics of curriculum development are complex and few African governments have taken the trouble to overcome sectarian or religious or ethnic conflicts that hamper such curriculum enterprises. And a lot of people don't acknowledge these problems in Africa. You know, a lot of folks talk about Africa as this oasis, right? Now, Africa is probably our best bet. But as it stands, Africa needs much work to occur, especially in education. However, for many African governments, this issue is better left alone than confronted despite its advantages. Whatever position may be canvassed by African governments on this important issue, we cannot run away out of convenience from addressing the adoption of some of the elements of the indigenous system into modern-day educational practices as a strategy for improving quality. This should be tackled in a creative manner, especially in this increasingly globalized world with its threat to cultural identities. We should seek to understand it, expand our views and practices, and not just discount it in favor of what we have always done before. African governments may have to take the important subject at the policy level, especially at this time when there is a call for an African renaissance and sustainable development. African people should not be intimidated by the argument about the complexity of this challenge, but must confront the subject as a priority for survival in this increasingly global world. And this last sentence is it. You are Africans, and you've got to stop being afraid, intimidated by how complex the challenge is. I know it's a challenge, but if many of us put our efforts in, we can get this done. We can get this done. And so my challenge to you guys is, if you want to see this, if this paper makes sense to you, and you want to see this get done, reach out to me and let's work together. Let's get it done. You don't have to be, as I've said many times before, you don't have to have, any particular skill. But if you have the desire together we'll find your place in the building of this curriculum. If you're a doctor, you're a lawyer, whatever, you can add, because you've gone through the public school system. You've gone through a school system that didn't bring you any closer. In fact, it made you more distant from your African people, from your community, etc. And if you're a conscious person, you should be able to recount where it all went off and what could be done better and what we need to do. Come and help do it. Lastly, don't forget that what I talked about with Onita Say from the pro-black perspective, reach out to him on Twitter, ONI TASET. I think I spelled that right. Or hit me up on Twitter at Bittermeds, BITTERMEDZ. I could direct you to him. And just know that it's next Saturday, November 14th. And the where, once you get in contact with him, he'll let you know. We're brainstorming for what we're going to do in 2021. There's a little idea of how we can do certain things. Maybe you have some great ideas as well. Come through. And while you're doing it, if you're listening to this, talk to me about curriculum. I have my own little setup. Come through. Let's talk about curriculum. Let's talk about building it. We need to push intelligence in our community. Enough with the entertainers now. These entertainers who talked all this shit about the election and all that stuff, what did it do? Get with intelligent people and create really African-centered, intelligent people so we could get this beast up off of us. That's been the show today. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you to those who actually tune in on YouTube on this live stream. It looks like the whole stream has gone through. I appreciate all of you who came on, checked it out, and I will talk to you guys later.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.